Welcome back to Sex Crimes Defense Podcast with Chance and Jay. Chance Oberstein is a criminal defense attorney in California. I'm a media professional. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be used as legal advice. Chance, what are we talking about today?
What are we talking about? Oh, okay, yeah, I remember now. We're talking about a transition. We're talking about looking at cases through a different set of glasses. When we talked about cases before on this program, we were talking about them through a system, a judicial system, a nation's justice system. Now that has changed. That was yesterday. This is today. Before we can really get into analyzing any case on any level, we're going to have to note the shift and we're going to have to talk about its implications. And so, what we're talking about today is a nation's justice system's integrity. That's what we're talking about today.
Well, what happens when the nation's justice system loses its integrity?
And that's the issue, really. I mean, the consequences ripple far beyond the courtroom. It's not just a legal failure, it's a societal fracture. That's what we're talking about today in general. Let's talk about what that looks like so that we can start to look at things differently than we did yesterday. One, when you have a societal fracture, when the system loses its integrity, there's an erosion of public trust. Now, I'm not saying that happened today, that's been going on, but it has now, it is starting to really roll like, a snowball down, down a mountain. Citizens begin to doubt the fairness of trials and the impartiality of judges. That's the first thing that happens. People may avoid reporting crimes or participating in the legal process, fearing bias or futility. And communities lose their faith in law enforcement, leading to increased tension and reduced cooperation. And there's a rise in injustice. Now, what do I mean by that? What would you guess that would entail?
Well, I'm going to say you're really tapping into high-level philosophical questions of law at this point, meaning as far as the perception of law in the eyes of the people.
Of
Am
course,
I
because those people constitute juries, they constitute prosecutors, they constitute defense folks, they constitute judges. We're talking about how this shift in the paradigm, okay? I'm not saying the system was ever perfect because it never was. But I'm saying that its apparent loss of integrity recently is changing the whole geographical landscape of the judicial system. And
you,
so
you know,
that's what I'm saying.
well, you're reminding me of I think we all arrive at some moment where we think that maybe somebody isn't qualified for a reasonable defense, but
Uh,
everybody is.
Everybody is.
And when we arrive at belief systems where some people are not qualified for a reasonable defense, we're incorrect.
Well, that is why we're talking about this, because all those other cases we looked at through the lenses of what was. Today we have to shift and we have to look at it from what is. Okay, and this is, before we can start to analyze cases on any level, whether it's federal, state, or local, whatever it is, we've got to know what we're talking about. And when I say a rise in injustice, what I'm really talking about is that wrongful convictions will become more common. Punishing the innocent while guilty walk free. That's what I'm saying, because when you get into a system that lacks integrity, that's exactly what happens. And on top of which, there's a lot of prosecutorial misconduct. So there's judicial bribery, there's police abuse that just distorts the outcomes. Victims may be denied justice, and systematic biases, which are racial, economic, political, they become really entrenched in the system. And that is a real issue, wouldn't you think?
Well, and I would say uh, if one is listening to this podcast, might think that as you talk, you're kind of talking from within the system and how the system works. And I'm kind of thinking as someone outside the system and viewing the way the system operates. And what I'm getting at is if you look at even just the length of sentencing from decades ago to today, it's changed dramatically, in my opinion.
Right. And now we're going through another seismic shift. Where we've shifted gears. Yes, it has changed, but it is starting to really roll in a certain direction that I think we have to recognize. And, when you look at social and political instability, which is where we're at in this country, you have to look at the perceived or actual corruption that can fuel protests, civil unrest, and even violence. That is where we are at. And, marginalized groups may feel targeted or excluded, deepening these societal divides, which means tribalism is the rule of the day. And when you've got political interference and legal outcomes, that undermines the democratic principles of this country. And people start to think differently about how things are done. Because when there's a breakdown of the rule of law, law loses their deterrent power and enforcement is seen as arbitrary or corrupt. And that is where we're starting to fall right now.
I think it's interesting that you're a legal professional, I'm a media professional, and the intersection of law and media is probably requires more education on a regular basis because I see headlines all the time that I think are not properly stated, such as, uh, I'm just going to say it. I saw an article recently that was clearly about an inappropriate relationship, but in the article, it read as repeated rapings. And I thought, okay, well, that you stated that because of the way the law is read, but that is not a reflection of reality, according to this article.
Well, there's going to be a lot of deception in the media, but there's also going to be a lot of confusion. But the state of play today is moving so fast, and media really hasn't caught up with that whirlwind. They really haven't, because you could just feel that there's a sense still of normality that really shouldn't be there. Okay? It shouldn't be there because things are starting to slip. And when you look at the system, and I'm talking about the overhead view, okay? The overhead view tells us that the system becomes vulnerable to manipulation by wealth, influence, or ideology. And philosophically, yes, I'm speaking to you about that. It will bleed into social media, but it's not right now. It's not really. The impact is not really being felt. It's being seen and somehow normalized, but it's not normal. And it's a whole different geography as far as the legal plane in this country is concerned.
Uh, I know it's impacting the law, but I think at its core, what you're raising is impacting the discussion we're actually trying to have, because we're trying to have a discussion about something that most people kind of think you really can't even talk about unless you're talking about it in a certain way. That it's not defensible, that it has no place in common decency, that it's only a conversation appropriate with extreme prejudice.
Well, in essence, I think what you're trying to say and what we're really talking about is loss of moral authority, really, because the justice system is supposed to be society's compass. And when it spins off course, so does our culture. Ethical standards erode, and cynicism replaces civic responsibility. So people turn to alternate forms of justice, which is vigilantism, tribalism, or underground systems. And we're starting to experience that in a really crazy way.
People defend vigilantism, which I always find so interesting because people don't defend chaos, anarchy, or Antifa, but they defend vigilantism.
Well, they defend vigilantism, tribalism, or underground systems, which are subsystems that are all over the United States. Which means that we don't live really in a democracy anymore. We live in a plurality, and we have actually for some time, but it's really becoming very apparent that that movement is getting stronger, stronger and stronger. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah, I want to ask you, I think at this point, does the collapse of prosecutorial neutrality at the federal level impact state and local prosecutors? And if so, what should we expect?
Well, that's actually where the rubber meets the road here, actually, and that's very perceptive of you because the collapse of prosecutorial neutrality at the federal level isn't just a headline, which it would be in social media. It's a systematic tremor that reverberates all the way down to state and local prosecutors, which is what I'm trying to get at here. Because all of this may seem like it's fun to read and it's fun to watch the tennis game and all that kind of stuff and who's on first, but to tell you the truth, it's a systematic tremor that reverberates all the way down to state and local prosecutors. So let's try to unpack this with some real examples and then forecast what the ripple effects might be. So let's take, for instance, James Coney and Letitia James. Let's take these recent indictments. Are you familiar with those?
I was thinking about them, and I just want to add that because I think this is where you're going, and I really appreciate it. When I read Department of Justice news, I feel like I don't have a grasp on what I'm reading.
Okay, so
And I think that's an on. I think that most people would agree with that. I don't know if they'd say it, but we don't understand what we're reading.
well, we also have a tendency to want to just believe what we read. I know that sounds crazy because our brains are wired in a certain way. When we see a police officer pull over somebody on the freeway, what's our first thought? Our first thought isn't, what was that for? Our first thought is, what did that person do? Because we presume guilt
Correct.
visually by
Yes.
seeing a
And
police officer with moral authority pull over a driver on the road.
and in fact, as we rubberneck and look, we add our own understanding of why they're guilty.
Absolutely. We feel it because there's a moral authority given to police officers on the road, to do that type of thing. We assume they're doing the right thing. See? And when we read news or we look at things, if someone's indicted, they must have done something wrong, right? Just like the driver that was pulled over.
And you know what's interesting? There is a shift because I can easily question a news article that I'm reading. But when it's on TV, it still seems more believable on TV.
Right. No matter what the explanation is, no matter if it's in our face, we still presume because we're operating as we start at the beginning of this thing, the beginning of this podcast, on the assumption of an old system way of looking at a new system, which is transgressing. Okay. We're still looking at it with the wrong glasses. We're not looking at it with the right glasses because we haven't adapted yet to what is going on. We're still giving legitimacy to a total system that is becoming very, very, very illegitimate.
And as you talked about a lens, we're applying our own lens of opinion to the news we're witnessing. So when you talk about James Comey, Letitia James, depending on which side I'm on, I'm going to assume a direction.
You are going to assume a direction because the indictments apparently are coming down from a political ideology, okay, devoid of any evidentiary value, you see? And we're putting on the lens of the old evidentiary value versus the new political ideology. for prosecuting cases.
And I'm going to give a concrete example of my confusion is that, okay, you've got an indictment of Comey. Do we have an indictment of Letitia James already?
Yes, we do.
We're in October 2025. Okay. And yet, so we have those two indictments, but don't we already have felony convictions associated with the president?
Well, yeah, we do. But you have to go back a step because that never came to accountability. Okay. The
Is
whole
that why it doesn't
no,
carry the way?
no, it's not necessarily why. And that's why you can't there's no way you can blame one side or another because they're both responsible. Here's the thing, okay? Our system had a certain geographical legal plane, but it was based on a bunch of other variables that went into the mix. It's not a simple mix, but at base, if someone's convicted of a crime, they must be held accountable. There has to be accountability. Okay, because if some people are held accountable and some are not, some people are above the law and some aren't. Okay, and it's totally imbalanced, which causes more harm than good. So if you're operating on the premise that you don't want to rock the boat because it's going to cause civil unrest, and all of a sudden the chairs change, and now the ideology moves, who's the blame? All of us. And we have to just suck it in and start to figure out what's going on now so we can look at the system and analyze cases and understand things as they are in real time. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, I'm going to assume that the court of public opinion, which is an interesting court because it doesn't really exist, but it does not have all the mechanics of all the thinking that you just described. The court of public opinion is a knee-jerk reaction, and people are very comfortable with that style of execution.
But there should not be a reliance on something that's not based in fact, and that's exactly what you're talking about. It's not based in fact. It's based on virtual reality. Okay, and what we're talking about
sound bites.
Yeah, sound bites and things, and and conspiracy theories and hearsay and what else?
This is
Who
where
knows?
and what you just said again, where media meets the law. Two completely different systems. Although they seem to be merging. I will say, when I read Department of Justice, I given my lens, I'm assuming Department of Justice has a very high standard, but I feel like it's being pulled into the mud with the whims of political pressure.
Well, I think that is a good analysis of exactly where we're going and what's happening. And I think probably in part 2 of this, we'll be able to talk about and focus on that question you asked and dig a little bit deeper into this discussion about what are the implications of this shift.
You've been listening to Sex Crimes Defense Podcast with Chance and Jay. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you on episode 2.